Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. I'm going to quote a Zionist, and this is hopefully the only time I do this, and there's a specific purpose for it. So, Ari Shavid wrote in The New Yorker, "The truth is that Zionism could not bear the Arab city of Lida. From the very beginning, there was a substantial contradiction between Zionism and Lida." Well, Sarah Ema Friedland, our guest today, took this sentence basically, and exploded it. Along with her co-director Rami Younis and many participants, they created a past history, present history, and a possible history of the city of Lid and its people in this beautiful film, what they call a sci-fi documentary that's rooted in the traditions of third world cinema. As Sarah's story and her work shares, cinema is something that brings joy and weirdness. It's political, and it's part of political conversations. Sarah talks about the collective work of cinema and the importance of showing the work of Palestinian filmmakers on their own terms. It's an awesome conversation, and I can be a pretentious cinephile, and I still came away with about a dozen movies on my queue after our conversation. And also, in these awful times, Sarah's story shows that through study, collective work, through listening to Palestinian voices, we can see that people are not only imagining, but actively building other worlds. Sarah Ema Friedland, welcome to Another Education is Possible.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me and for doing this really important work.
Thank you for your work. We're recording during a particularly difficult moment on top of nearly 2 years, 75 years of difficult moments. And we start with every guest just kind of where they started. So what did Judaism, Zionism, and Palestine look like for you growing up?
Thank you for starting in this place. I often feel like the Jewish anti-Zionist narrative has become kind of flattened by Israelism's popularity, which I think is a wonderful movie, and I love them and I love the work they do. But like, I think it's important to also highlight all the different kind of nuance within our experience as anti-Zionist Jews. And mine is very different from that. I grew up in a family that I like to call like more than only Jewish. So my dad is Jewish, my mom was raised Catholic, and I have two siblings who were adopted from Colombia and who at this point don't really like identify as like super with their Jewishness. We're like a very more than one thing kind of family, but Judaism was very strong. We grew up going to Hebrew school twice a week in a Reform synagogue in Westchester, and but also had like all these other kind of influences coming in, which I think like comes back later in terms of my rejection of Zionism and why I reject it, and especially kind of the narrative around Zionism that I was raised with. My father's parents were refugees from Belarus, fleeing, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and they were very, very Zionist. They were labor Zionists. They were part of the Faband. My grandmother was like a Jewish woman Zionist. We all got Israel bonds, like all of that stuff. Even though my mother is not Jewish, my parents lived in Israel for just under a year, and it was like a really wonderful at the time experience for her, and so she also kind of carried a lot of Zionism. And then, like my parents took us to Israel. Like I often say I went to Israel before I went to New Jersey. We were four, it's like my first memories. And for them, it was after 67, but they had no idea, which is like very wild because my parents are pretty political people. But I think there's such a desire to not see for a lot of people. I grew up not in a kind of ultra Zionist household, but in a like the occupation started at 67. No understanding of the Nakba, no, like I grew up with this narrative that the Zionists were fighting the British and not the Palestinians during the founding of the State of Israel. And so there was a lot really to like undo and unpack for me, even though I don't think it was complete erasure. I think also the thing that was like really big for me was that I think because of my dad's kind of socialist New York immigrant upbringing, he was really focused on like this idea of like Jewish socialist utopia and the kibbutzes, and it's like what a wonderful melting pot of different kinds of people. I kind of thought in some ways like this family that I grew up in that again was like very multicultural, not just one thing, not one religion, not one ethnicity, like that Israel could be a place where we would be welcomed was kind of like this fantasy that I had in my mind, which obviously is just not true. We can think of that in so many ways, not only in terms of the oppression, ethnic cleansing, and genocide of Palestinian people, but also in terms of Ashkenormativity. That word is like so hard to swallow. We really need to think of an easier one to pronounce. But anyway, and so, like again, I think that was like a particularly unique journey for me in relationship to the kind of Jewish household I grew up in. And then when I got to college, I was still not totally like had no idea what the Nakba was, all of these things. And then I was thinking about going on Birthright, and I had a suite mate who was Lebanese, and she was like, "What the fuck are you thinking?" And really gave me an education, and that was really important for me. And then kind of fast forward, honestly, quite a far way to 2015. I read this article that was excerpted from this book that's a quite Zionist book by Ari Shavit, who's an Israeli writer and reporter called My Promised Land. But there was a essay from it that was published in the New Yorker that was all about what happened in Lyd, basically about the Palmach invasion and expulsion in Lyd. And it was like mind blowing to me. I'd never heard any of this history. I had no idea. Again, my dad grew up like the Palmach were his heroes. That trickled down to me. All of that. When I read this, it was really like reorienting. And it was also infuriating because his narrative is like, this was a necessary evil, which is what a lot of kind of liberal Zionists have espoused over the years. And I was like, what, how, this is so horrifying. How could we possibly consider this necessary in any way? Like, absolutely disgusted. And again, like really shattering this mythology that I had been raised with about kind of kibbutz and socialism and utopia and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's all, you know, raised on land theft and murder. And this was not something that I had known. And so that's basically when Lyd started. I'd already been a filmmaker for a number of years, and I could use these skills I have to really, at the time, I was thinking like share this history with my Jewish American community who really needs to know about this. And then I quickly was like, I can't do this alone. This is not my story to tell. And I reached out to this friend, Hannah Mermelstein, who is an amazing person, an anti-Zionist Jew who has been doing this work for a very, very long time, who is one of the co-founders of Birthright Unplugged, and which is a group that used to take American Jews. They would basically sign up for their birthright trip, and that with the intention of leaving from the airport to go on this alternate trip of education about Palestine solidarity. And so she put me in touch with Rami Younis, who's the co-director of the film Lyd. And we started working together and hit it off. And we made that film together, which came out in 2023. It took a long time, as documentaries do. But also, I think there's a lot of reasons that it took that long. And I'm glad it did because, I had a lot of learning and unlearning to do along the way, but I think it also made the film richer to follow like the present day of Lid for a longer amount of time.
Oh,
Nobody wanted to fund it.
there's not a huge market for documentaries in the 2020s, let alone radical anti-Zionist documentaries. So as we near talking about, in more detail both this film and the power of filmmaking in the Palestine solidarity movement in general, I wonder if we could just linger for a moment and tease out a bit more about your journey. That I'm hearing this
Mhm.
idea of, as you point out, even within a film like Israelism, it creates something that I feel like this podcast has done as well. This very, I'm going to try it as well, Ashken normative narrative of someone like myself who grew up very Zionist, encountered ideas, became anti-Zionist. I'm wondering particularly if there's stuff happening in between this idea of I want to go to Birthright and a friend is saying that is bullshit. What the hell are you thinking? And 2015. What's happening in that time that's making Lid possible?
Yeah, it is like a really like, long span of time in there in which I really wasn't focused on Israel Palestine that much at all, but I was learning how to be a filmmaker and engaging, like with leftist politics in other ways. And so I think all of that training and work opened me up to kind of like to that moment that happened in 2015. Because I think, as a filmmaker, we are, and especially I think as a documentary filmmaker, somebody who kind of like the works and thinks in reality, we are kind of trained to to think to kind of like I think kind of the classical training in documentary is like to think about the truth and to like get the truth out there and the importance of storytelling and narratives can, change the way people think and all of this, which honestly I was at that point really frustrated with. Um, and I think it's extremely strong within the American documentary system in particular. And I went to film school in Cuba. I studied in Cuba for 3 years. I first went to the University of Havana, and that's where I encountered this film theorist. I took a class with him. His name was Pedro Noah. And it was, again, one of these moments where I was like, oh, there's really another way of like thinking about things. Cuban filmmaking is very collaborative. It's also really interested in playing with reality and specifically kind of like being critical through satire and fun, and even within documentary, like you watch Cuban documentary, and it's like, um, you have to laugh at reality because reality in Cuba is so hard for so many reasons for so long. And so, I went to this Cuban film school, which was very much, it's called the International School of Film and Television in San Antonio de los Baños, Cuba. It was started by kind of third world cinema people. It's actually where some of that first work was coming out of, and it was shortly after the revolution. And so it was a place where filmmakers were trying to challenge both the US system and the Soviet system and come up with a third way of making film that was rooted in like third worldism, which, as you may know from filmmakers like Kidlat Tahimik and Usman Semben and Sarah Gomez from Cuba, like these filmmakers, I think Kidlat and Sarah Gomez are great kind of examples of people who have done work with documentary that's wild and playful and like fantasy driven, and so like that was like a it has always been a huge inspiration for me, kind of blending magical realism and politics. And so that kind of formation has carried through for my filmmaking, the way I approach art, the way I approach my teaching, like all of this. When I came to that 2015 moment where again I really like hadn't been doing a lot of work with Palestine, as a young adult, I really wasn't practicing my Judaism, although I am now in this moment where I had this very different kind of formation from the where American documentary sits, where is like kind of based in our own mythology. I think of kind of Horatio Alger, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like first person narrative, faces conflict, like triumphs in the end and returns home, like typical hero journey kind of stuff. That's what gets funded in the US. And I think it's like really problematic because the form influences the way people receive information, and it kind of deeply reinscribes these entrenched narratives that are, the falsehoods of America. I was like already at this point where I was like so fed up with this currency of issue driven first person. You've got to have your impact strategy for your documentary if you want to change the world, and these films are going to change the world. And I was like, oh, this is so stupid. I don't want to do this anymore. And then basically what happened is I was like, holy shit, I've been fed a false narrative my whole life. The way we tell stories does matter. Like the stories we tell do matter. It greatly impacts the world. And I was kind of reinvigorated, and making Lid has allowed me to exercise that muscle in a different way.
That's I'm gonna try to not ramble and go down. That's amazing that you studied such a tradition of like Cuban cinema. I remember in undergrad, memories of underdevelopment just blew my
Mm-hmm.
fucking mind. Before we really jump into Lit, I'm wondering if were there any, I've heard so many people talk about in my own conversations, but in the 20 some guests that we've had, there are names that come up a lot. Edward Said probably being the biggest one. But I'm
Yeah.
wondering, I don't want to just pigeonhole you, but since you're a
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
filmmaker, I haven't heard many people talk about something like Five Broken Cameras that's such a well-known documentary. But was cinema, not just
Yeah.
third cinema, but
Yeah.
specifically Palestinian cinema,
Yeah.
influencing you at all?
Yeah, definitely. Like I saw Five Broken Cameras like before I started really thinking about the Nakba in this, I was the 20 in 2015 and post 2015, like, and Five Broken Cameras did have a big impact on me. It was, yeah, it was really horrifying, and it definitely did that work. And we can come back to kind of the collaboration and allyship and all of these questions within cinema that have resurfaced again. I think for me, like in the post 2015 learning period, one of the most important films for me is a film by called Ghost Hunting,
Mm.
which is an incredible, incredible film. I think it's been underseen, especially in this country. I think it only played like one or two festivals here, if any. But this film is told from his perspective, from Raad Andoni's perspective, as being somebody who had been kidnapped by police and tortured in the West Bank. And what he did was he did a casting call for people who had also had that experience. And then he worked with them to make this film where they role play the people being tortured and the guards.
Mhm.
And the film is so incredible. And the making of the film is also so incredible. He had therapeutic support staff on time the whole time doing this, and they rented this big soundstage. And the film is like this very meta film about, working through this trauma collectively, but also making a film together, and the power dynamics that exist within all of these experiences, both the lived experience of being tortured in an Israeli prison and the experience of making a film on a set. And it's a stunning, stunning, stunning film. So I think that film was really influential for me. And then also a film not made by a Palestinian, but I think very ethically and thoughtfully made, Samuni Road, made by the Italian director Stefano Savona, which is about a family in Gaza, um, 2015, that had been, during that time period, by the state of Israel, by Israeli soldiers. And it's an incredible film, and I think it was very influential for Lid. It works with this family to create these imagined narratives recalling this moment when it happened, and it recreates that moment using animation, but it's woodblock animation. So
Mm,
every frame is a different woodblock. And so it has this very kind of agitated look that's just so perfect with the context. Um, and then another film that I really love is by my friend Razan Al Salah, who is a Lebanese Palestinian filmmaker and who made this really beautiful film. It's a short film that is made in Google Maps and it has two names, is called YFWB 100YO, which I think is probably pronounced alliteratively different than that. And the former title was Your Father Was Born 100 Years Old, and So Was the Nakba.
mm.
And it's a short film. It's a 7-minute film from 2017, and Razan uses Google Maps to go back to Haifa, which is where her family was expelled from in 1948 during the Nakba of 1948. And it's actually a performance that she does in Google Maps. It's like a one-shot performance. And it's really, really incredible. And it's kind of epistolary. It's a letter
Mm.
between her and her grandmother.
Oh, wow. So I'm going to ask a question that I'm sure is right up there with the where do you get your ideas in terms of artists hating it. But I am wondering like what the role of filmmaking is here because all of those sound impactful. I would imagine particularly documentarians there's this like you said you're challenging this to an extent that it's not trying to like teach you and you learn and then there's this exact outcome. It's there's something more complex and more expressive
Yeah.
and more disruptive. But I do wonder, like, rather than me reading Ghassan Kanafani, what pedagogically might films offer in in both anti-Zionist work and just broadly in the Palestine solidarity movement? Is there something unique about cinema?
I think that it's important to think about this also with like the history of how film has operated, um, within the Palestine liberation movement to understand that I think film really does have a place in all struggle, not only Palestine, but obviously as I said, I come out of kind of like a third cinema understanding, and part of that is also in Cuban cinema, there was always a kind of militant arm to the revolution, cinematically speaking, and it's the same thing in Palestine,
And sorry
you
to
know.
interrupt, but also very worth noting, tied into education. The Brigadistas were
Hmm.
it's not an accident that they focused so heavily on cinema and on putting teachers out there.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and often in the same kind of campaign. So there was Cinema Mobile that would go to
Mhm.
rural areas
Yep.
with film and not necessarily political film. Sometimes it was Charlie Chaplin, and along with them went teachers in the literacy campaign. And this is in Cuba, shortly after the revolution. And so, yeah, I think film has often been used in pedagogically, but also in revolutionary ways just to like bring a little bit of joy, which is really important. In Palestine, the PLO had a cinema arm. So there was a Palestine film unit that made a lot of like films of the PLO training and just kind of like their campaigns. And there's a really beautiful film about this in particular, kind of by this Palestinian filmmaker, Mohamed Yacoubi, who also is part of PFI, the Palestine Film Institute, and has done a lot of amazing work for Palestinian film, period. But this film, Off Frame, aka Revolution Until Victory, is basically an archival film where he was able to go all over the world to collect these PLO film unit films, clean them up, represent them in this film, which is, I think, really important to understanding the role that film has had in Palestinian solidarity work, because it's rooted within Palestinian liberation work. And so I feel like for me specifically as a filmmaker, doing the work of kind of bringing this film into the world. Yeah, I think there's so much to talk about, but I I guess I also think that, like, how to say this? I think it's also important to recognize that there's obviously a limitation in film as activism. And I think what we were talking about, what I was hinting at earlier is that I feel like when the activism is really outcome driven, it's a problem because then it kind of becomes like people want to see the metrics in order for you to then get more funding or whatever. And then it becomes part of this kind of capitalist machine of filmmaking that is, that I think is a real problem in terms of what films get made. And I do think that the work films do is much more nuanced, much more it's unmeasurable. It's really unmeasurable because it doesn't happen immediately. You see a film and it acts on you like for a very long time. It like activates based on conversations you might have that are 5 years after you've seen the film. I think all art does that. What might be a little bit different about film and especially about documentary is that you're spending time with people in a very immediate way. We are recording with people and then bringing these people that most audiences would not be able to meet, would not be able to hear from directly, like into the theater space, into their living rooms, onto their laptops. That encounter is very significant and important. Like people become real people, whereas they're maybe more abstract when you're reading about them and or where you're seeing a play where a person is represented. And Rami often says this thing that I think is very true. Rami, my co-director of Lid, that like in the US in particular, like people have been humanizing Palestinians, like the work of humanizing Palestinians has been done. And it's like you're just like constantly doing this work of humanizing Palestinians, which feels disgusting at this point, but is clearly like you know, incredibly important work. And, he's kind of like, so here I am, I'm here, I'm a human, I'm on this Q&A with you. We really shouldn't have to be doing this. It's incredibly disgusting. But I think that we also have to think about, often I get this question in Q&A is like, people have been making films, people have been writing books, people have been doing this work for so long and nothing has changed. But we don't know what would happen if that work hadn't been done. We don't know how worse it might have been.
Mm.
So I think the exciting work that film in particular can do is like these is hearing from people that you may not get to hear from. I was recently talking with these folks in rural Massachusetts who I know who I'm also working with on a film, and I invited them to a screening of Lid because I wanted them to understand like what my work is like. And so we had a screening at Amherst Cinema and they came and these are like, rural people from the US who are not involved in this struggle. And they were like really touched. And what they said was like, yeah, just like they're just people. They're just like people like us. Like that's, it. And I think when you watch a news report or something that's more sensational, like it actually does the opposite work of that
Yeah.
often. Then I do want to say one more thing. The other important thing about filmmaking that I think, is similar to theater or other works that are highly collaborative, but is the process and the process being so incredibly collaborative. Um, and, I think with Palestine solidarity, there have been people who've been doing that work for a really long time as non-Palestinians in collaboration with Palestinians. In particular, thinking about Monica Mauer, who's a German filmmaker who made films between 1977 and 1982 and worked with the PLO film unit and made 6 films about Palestinians living in diaspora and has continued that work. Like she made those incredible documents of that moment and collaborated with Palestinians to do that, and now continues to collaborate with Emily Jassir to preserve some of that material. And then I was involved with a project that there's a film school in Bethlehem, or it's an art school called Dar el Kalima. And I worked with a really wonderful professor there in my previous role at Skidmore College and funded them to work with her students to take Monica's archive and remake one of those films. The new like younger generation of filmmakers is working with this archive made by a German woman in 1981 to like remake those films so that they speak to their concerns. And so like the cross-generational, like cross, time collaboration there is really beautiful. And then I'll just mention one other thing that I think is really important to mention is that none of this happens like out of a vacuum. I think there are really important organizations that have been doing the work to kind of like connect media makers in the US with Palestinian media makers for a long time. And one of them is the Palestinian American Research Center, which is a really amazing organization. And I went on one of their media seminars, and they basically took us around the West Bank, a bunch of media makers and academics who study media, and connected us with collaborators in Palestine so that we could work together to kind of get the Palestinian narrative to the US in the nuanced and important ways. And like that was also one of the ways that we were able to make Lid.
And that, I think that it contributes further to what you're saying about interrupting this idea of not just the documentaries themselves having this
Mm-hmm.
individualizing narrative, but documentarians often having either there's like the great documentarian who works so hard to disrupt political order, or there's a pair of siblings who document American life and
Yeah.
right, like really getting into that. And it's like, no, there's so much more to that. And I want to pick up on that. And I mean, there's more than I could possibly capture in what you said there, but I think I want to pick up on two things that one, I think of education very much in the same way that I love how you framed this idea of resisting outcome-based thinking
Mm-hmm.
when thinking about art. And I work in a world in formalized education where everything is outcome-based, right?
Yeah.
From tests
Yeah.
and grades to progressing through that the outcome of getting that piece of paper that says you did the education good, right?
Right.
All of that. But when you think about studying and encountering ideas and becoming a different person, that's not linear and
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
can't tell where that comes from. And
Yeah.
I've had that so many times with cinema. And I think in terms of this idea of collaboration, I really want to pick up on just a bit of the tension that you
Mm-hmm.
may have experienced or just how you navigate it. I'd like
Mm-hmm.
to hear a bit more about we could try to wedge education in here, but maybe it's not learning and figuring out, it's just what happened. But how you approached the collaborative process. And
Mm-hmm.
when I thought of this question, I was immediately
Mm-hmm.
thinking of a bit of that controversy around the film No Other Land that came out
Mm-hmm.
last year and won the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oscar, and
Mm-hmm.
how collaboration is politicized in that
Yeah.
way. And then
Yeah.
also within the US, it's like, yeah, US filmmakers are tasked with doing this humanizing and rehumanizing over and over. But also, I really appreciated a lot of the pushback that Israeli filmmaker got because it's like, why did you speak for someone? That's a long-winded way of saying, like, what did it look like before we talk about the film directly to
Mm.
bring it together, particularly as a US Jew? How did you approach this?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I've pretty much only made work, it's especially feature-length documentary collaboratively. I'm somebody who either has co-directed or co-produced really closely every project I've worked on. With short films, I've been sole maker on some of them, but for me, like I really love collaboration and I think I'm a pretty practiced collaborator. I'm also in a film collective called Meerkat Media, which is very collaborative focused. And Rami Younis, who is my co-director on the film, and he is a Palestinian citizen of Israel who's from Lid but currently based in Haifa. And he is also somebody who has done a lot of work collaboratively. So he was an editor of 972. He is a co-founder of their Hebrew language sister site, which is called Local Call, which is basically translating articles in 972, which is a left-wing publication that includes both anti-Zionist Israelis or anti-occupation Israelis and Palestinian writers. It's pretty much one of the only news sources out of 48 that like is critical in any way. And so, yeah, so he's somebody who has not only done a lot of collaborations, but also has collaborated a lot with Jews and believes in collaboration with Jews. And I think also really wants to speak to Jews in particular. Not only it was like extremely important to him that the film resonated with Palestinians in a deep, deep way, but I would say, I guess I would reframe that to say he's somebody who doesn't want to speak into an echo chamber and believes pretty strongly in that. And so I think our collaboration, like coming from both of these practices and histories, was like off to a good start from the beginning. And we've become extremely close friends and like I think complement each other in a lot of ways. I think in terms of collaboration and specifically like filmmaking collaboration between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis or diasporic Jews is that it is really complicated and is really messy. I think with Rami and I, like, it's not a similar thing to Five Broken Cameras or No Other Land because we're not in the film. So you don't actually see our relationship in the film, or you don't get invested in some idea of like us, our buddy relationship as part of the film. I'm also like I felt pretty clearly that the expertise I was bringing to this was my filmmaking expertise. Like Rami is a journalist, but is not like an image maker necessarily, and like was very much, deferring to him in terms of content, in terms of people that we were speaking to, in terms of like directions the film would go in, even though I did obviously bring a lot of my ideas and I wasn't passive about things, but his expertise was the most important expertise. In terms of like the breakdown of labor, when we were working, I would be doing the cinematography and he would be doing the interviewing. I don't speak Hebrew and I don't speak Arabic. And so, a lot of times I was kind of like in the dark about what was going on, but we just had a lot of trust and he really trusted me with the camera and I really trusted him with the content of the interviews. And I think a lot of the people that we interviewed in Lid in particular are people that he's grown up with, that he's known his whole life. And so, it was like very comfortable. And I think there are also ways that my positionality as a Jewish person and as an outsider kind of were very useful. I think, having me in the room made it not only Rami's project, this person that they had grown up with, like it was this collaboration that was like, a multi-country collaboration. But also, our film includes these archival interviews with Palmach soldiers that we got from the Palmach archive.
Yeah.
And I think, me going in there and being like, yeah, my name is Sarah Friedland. I'm a Jewish American. We're making a film about what happened in Lida in 1948. Like, they were more willing to give me this footage, which we did not pay for. They just gave it to us. And we also filmed with the mayor of Lid, who's an extremely
Yeah.
racist, fascist guy. He knows who Rami is, like, couldn't necessarily be in the room. And so I was there. We're making a film about the city of Lid.
Wow.
I think in some ways that's more complex, but what I have felt a lot is like, I know that people program our film because it's like safer because I'm Jewish.
Hmm.
And I have a lot of conflict about that. And I especially feel that way because I know that a lot of Palestinian films don't get programmed because they don't have their Jewish beard alongside them. And
I've never heard it said that way, but that is so perfect.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
I just want to encourage people to program films by Palestinians, period. Don't be afraid. Like, these are the people we need to hear from. Specifically in terms of No Other Land, I think the film is really beautiful. I think the film is an incredible film. I think like the film as it stands in its own as its own thing is a really important film. And I think that part of the reason the film is good is because it shows the complexity of collaboration and allyship within the film. What I think is, and I personally have a lot of respect for Basil and for Yuval. And I think what is becomes really complicated and is that again this thing of like these films become more than they are because they show a relationship that people want to see, which is like Palestinians and Jews, getting along, which is not the norm. This is, an exception, and that's why people want to see it. I think like yes, I think Yuval's speech had problems. Like the way the whole thing went down was very unfortunate. But I think also, like, this is a guy who has spent so much time doing incredibly important solidarity work. And I also don't want that to be forgotten in the way this is talked about. Like, literally, his research is used in the ICJ case against the state of Israel. Nobody is perfect. Like, and there is not room for perfection in this moment. And so I think what is the real hard pill for me to swallow is that like but when I walked out of No Other Land, I was talking to friends and I was like, it's a great film. What I feel that is unfortunate is that this film has to get made like every 10 years where
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
people need to see like this collaboration in order to become invested. Like that is a major problem. That kind of like needing to have a Jewish beard in order to accept the validity of the Palestinian struggle is a huge problem.
Yeah. And to say, reminding yet again, it's like this is the baseline of saying
Yeah.
Palestinians are
Yeah.
humans. I was really wondering how you, and maybe this is a good point to turn to, I'm sure you're exhausted having done this a million times, but so that we can ground it a bit, maybe just give a
Hmm.
few
Hmm.
sentences about what this film is. Because to me, it's very much like a scrapbook. I love that
Hmm.
there's archival work.
Hmm.
Your interlocutors appear in multiple ways, but I shouldn't speak about it. You can you just share what is this film?
Yeah, so the film, we call it a sci-fi documentary, and it's a feature-length film, and it's about the city of Lyd, which is in 48, and what happened there during the Nakba of 1948. And so it kind of tells the story of this massacre and expulsion that happened in Lyd, where hundreds of people were killed by Palmach Israeli soldiers, pre-state Israeli soldiers. Were killed in a mosque, and then about 50, between 40 and 50,000 people were expelled from the city and forced to march for days to the West Bank or other places. And so it thinks about that history and the ongoing Nakba, and so the impact of that history on the present, not only within 48 in the city of Lyd, but also we spend time in the film with Palestinians in the West Bank. In the film not only thinks about the ongoing Nakba in Lyd, but also in Balata refugee camp in Nablus in the West Bank, and the three generations of Palestinian refugees living there. But so the film kind of tells that history in that present, but the sci-fi part comes in through animated sequences where we kind of reimagine history. What if the Nakba had never happened? And what would life be like in the city? What would life be like for our documentary participants who voice their own animated avatars in these sections? And we tweak kind of a few things in history to make that present reality happen. We go further back from 1948. We kind of share this speculative history of like, what if the Arab states had fought off the Ottomans and then European colonizers and Palestine were liberated and were part of what we call the Greater Levant. Then what would have happened after, during Semitic pogroms and the Holocaust and in Europe, what would have happened?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to get too much into it. I don't know that spoilers is the right term, but like I think people should see it. But I mean, there are these scenes of like the two realities kind of tearing towards each
Mhm.
other. It ends on a line that I think completely captures the idea of this podcast and captures the radical imagination about how to imagine other worlds. Um, and I'm wondering if it, like I don't want to just keep getting into the weeds of decision making, but I wonder if you could just talk about the idea of imagining other worlds and what that does. But I also wonder if within that you could touch a little bit on the decision making process about how you came to imagine this other world and the script that emerged to imagine what anti-colonialism would look
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
in the Levant, to
Mhm.
imagine celebration days that came about and how they would be
Mhm.
recognized. It did strike me that there was a clear reference to Jewish folks having a place in the
Mhm.
classroom in the world.
Mhm.
And yeah,
Mhm.
it's probably beyond the scope of this, but I also loved the way that school showed up in the piece.
Yeah.
The teacher's amazing, and there were some heartbreaking moments with her as well. But yes, so what would
Yeah.
imagining other worlds, enacting other worlds?
Yeah, so this idea actually came up, and maybe this is why the film is somewhat of a collage, because it had started as a more for kind of journalistic piece. And then we were invited to pitch to be part of like this cohort of films and filmmakers organized by the Palestine Film Institute in 2018 to go to Cannes and pitch our films for funders and stuff. And so we were talking about our film and we were talking about it over and over again. And we realized that we were making a film that neither of us would want to watch, that it was too, like, yes, it is incredibly important to tell this history that in the US has been completely buried. Um, so from my perspective, like it was really important to tell this history, but I was like, are we re-victimizing people? There's nothing liberatory about this. And for Rami, who's coming at it from a completely other perspective, he's thinking about there have been like many Nakba films. And he didn't, and like using his language, not mine, like he didn't want to make another Nakba film. He wanted it to be different, and he wanted, he wanted it to speak to Palestinian audiences in a different way. So we kind of went back to the drawing board, and I'm like a very big fan of specifically sci-fi and speculative literature. Like I really love Ursula K. Le Guin and lots of other people. But anyway, so we started thinking about sci-fi and speculative kind of work and how we could integrate that. It really just like took off for us. We were like, it was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. There's so like all the idea, it was just like ping, 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 like, and so we co-wrote the script together. Rami had been given a fellowship at the Divinity School at Harvard, a fellowship that now doesn't exist, in a program where many people have been fired or dismissed from because of all the work that they've done supporting Palestinians.
Yeah.
So so during that time we wrote the script, and for me, like again with all my learning and unlearning that I did during this time, one of the really important texts was this book Mountain Against the Sea, which is by Salim Tamari, who's a historian and writer and really incredible Palestinian academic. And this book basically is a kind of each chapter focuses on a different um, kind of essay drawn from memoirs of pre-state Palestinians. And so a lot of the kind of nuggets that are in the film are coming out of that and other places for sure. So for example, like one of the direct things in the film that comes from Salim Tamari is he talks about these kind of synchronistic holidays that would happen in Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem wasn't divided in quarters before the British got there. Everybody just lived in neighborhoods and like live, like not to be all like kumbaya, but live together. And he writes about Christians, Jews, and Muslims like just hanging out and celebrating each other's holidays. And like one of those was Saint George, who becomes kind
Mm.
of like a symbol for the synchronicity. And Saint George is also, his mother was Lidawi. His mother was a Lydian, and so his remains are buried in the Church of St. George in Lyd. And so he's an incredibly important symbol for the city. And he comes up also in our documentary interviews where they talk about, celebrating St. George, this Muslim family with their like Christian neighbors. And so it's very real. There's also another one of these like really wonderful kind of nuggets that comes out of the history of Lyd is George Habush, who went on to be the founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, is also from Lyd. And he was studying at the American University of Beirut during the Nakba. And then during the Nakba, he returns to Lyd and works in the hospital there. He was studying to be a doctor, and his sister was killed in Lyd during the Nakba. And that's one of the things that made him become a revolutionary. And so in our film, there's a university in Lyd, and Lyd does not have a university. It's pretty disinvested in the real world of today. And so for Rami, it was really important to have a university in Lyd. And of course, it would be named after George Habush, who in our alternate reality probably would have been an academic or a doctor because Lyd was already free.
I really like that part of the movie, and I was wondering about that. I love that it's not placating too much.
Yeah, they're just
And there's
there.
like these little Easter eggs
Yeah,
for folks. I was like, why is that Habash? So
yeah.
yeah, I didn't know he was from Lynn. And that like PFLP connection is really interesting. But again, I love that it's an invitation to explore rather than like, let's tell you what you're supposed to know about these various people.
Along those lines, like I think one of the things that I grew up with in terms of my Ashkenormative Jewish upbringing is that, it was never safe for Jews in the Middle East after the Second Temple, after the exile. And, you know, I'm not saying it was perfect. Of course, like anywhere, there were times when it was not safe, but it was never like the kind of lack of safety that we experienced in Eastern Europe or Western Europe for that matter. Like it was a like that mythology, I think is really, really harmful and
Yeah.
continues to be really harmful. And I think it's really important to understand that there were Jews who lived in this place in safety and in collaboration with their neighbors, and that the founding of the State of Israel played a role in destroying that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the people who is really important to me and kind of talking this through is Ariel Angel, who's editor in chief of Jewish Currents, and her family is from Salonika, which was destroyed during the Holocaust in Greece. And also she is a Palestinian. She has Palestinian family. She is a Mizrahi Jew. And one of the things that like Rami and I both really agreed on was to kind of we did not want to carry forth this mythology in our alternate reality. We wanted to
Yeah.
show that like Jews possibly could have been welcomed there because there were already Jewish communities that were living not only in Jerusalem and Hebron, but in Syria and in Iraq and in northern Africa. And again, I know it was not perfect. I don't want to create false utopias, but in our film, when I was talking to Ariel about it, she watched Rough Cut and she was like, "It is kind of interesting that you elected not to have any Hebrew writing in the alternate reality." And I was like, I guess that is kind of, we should rethink that. And so we thought about that. And then I kind of went back to the Salim Tamari text, and there's a chapter in his book that's about a Palestinian Jew whose name was Yitzhak Shami, who's from Hebron. His mother was a Hebronite Jew and his father was from Syria. And he grew up speaking Arabic in the house, and he wrote in Arabic and he wrote in Ladino. And then when the State of Israel is founded, he switches to writing in Hebrew. And again, I think this is another thing. Like I think there's a lot of our diasporic Jewish culture that has been flattened by Zionism, and that is also a huge loss. And I
Yeah.
didn't want to see that loss duplicated in our film. So it's like hard to see, but in one of the corners of the Hamash Square in our recreated animations, there's a little sign that says in Hebraic letters, Shami's pen. And we imagine it as a bookstore for
Mm.
like, like Ladino, Yiddish, like all these texts for the Jewish population that would have emigrated.
I think that, that does a lot to, as you're saying, show a complex relationship, but show, yes, it's important to challenge this very flattened vision of Judaism and to show an alternative history that I'm reading Layla Khalid's autobiography now, and she talks about she uses the word cordial a lot, a cordial
Mm-hmm.
relationship with
Mm-hmm.
Jewish neighbors. I also think that there's something really useful in that to challenge, growing up, I always heard that this was an ancient 5,000-year-old Jews and Muslims have always hated each other. And to show
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
I think also helps ground this in the Nakba,
Yeah.
right? It disrupts
Yep.
that idea of like, this is a Zionist thing.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, like trying to always kind of reframe this as this not people only think of it as a religious um, war, and it is not. It is a colonialist, it is a war about land, and it is also like a refugee crisis that never got resolved,
Yeah.
an
Which
ongoing refugee crisis.
which I think I'm gonna close with a pretty difficult question, at least for me. So I
Hmm.
understand if you want to
Hmm.
grapple with it. As I mentioned at the start, we're recording at just another horrifying moment. This is, I don't know what today is. It's the end of July of 2025. I wonder about a film like Lid that has this playful imagination and expands our thinking, challenges us to do education differently, I would argue, and to think about another world through all of that work. And of course, the project of ending the genocide is one of building another world, but I do wonder how you grapple with kind of the material reality of this moment when doing that kind of
Hmm.
radical playful thinking that's
Yeah.
present in your film.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really important question. And I think also like the material effects of the genocide have also impacted people who have contributed to the film, and so it's in no way abstract. I will get back to the crux of the question, but I will also say that our one of the film is also narrated by a Palestinian actress, Maisa Abed El Hadi, who is an amazing actress. And like on October 7th, she posted a couple things on social media that maybe could be seen as off color, but she took them down immediately, and they would not merit the response that they got from the Israeli state by any means. It was absolutely disgusting. They basically took her in, and she was held in Israeli jail and interrogated, and then she was under house arrest for a year and a half. And like her career was, she wasn't allowed to use the internet, she wasn't allowed to go outside of her house without her father. They were making a huge example out of this person who posted two things that like compared to what so many people have posted who are fascist, ultra Zionist. It's so shameful and disgusting. Like that which these two posts that she posted, which were really nothing, could be called inflammatory, and nothing happens to these other people who have done far worse. And Balata refugee camp gets raided nightly by the Israeli army. Rami has his life has been turned up and down and upside down in so many ways. And I think this is another place where like the reality of collaboration becomes really important to think about, because my life goes on. Like I face some, like, yeah, I work at NYU. I could get fired. Like that's a reality that could happen, but like whatever, like the stakes are so much lower, and I think about that all the time. And in terms of our film, I think like yes, it is really important to do the work of imagining a different reality, and it is also so painful right now. And I think also even outside of the context of the ongoing genocide, like the work of imagining an alternate reality is like a small part of it. You have to then do the work to organize to like try to get towards that. And doing
Which,
that,
sorry to interrupt, but I do want to point out that, again, without spoilers, your film really does that. It includes this archival work that reveals the Pomoc's
right, war
role and
crimes.
also shows I don't know how to put it, organizing work happening in Lid,
Yeah,
in a very central way, right? So I don't, I just want to be careful of saying like, it's not like you just have a few interviews of, hey, the Nakba happened and it was awful. Now here's another world. Like it's a
yeah,
very textured, I use the word scrapbooky because you bring in
yeah.
archives, animation, interviews with, anyway, I'm sorry I'm interrupting.
Yeah, no, totally. And you know, the film is like 70% documentary footage of what has happened, what is happening, and you know, 30% animation. So it's like, you know, very much like this. But I do feel like, you know, we get this question in Q&As all the time, and it's really hard to know how to respond. And I just think that we all need to keep doing what we're doing. Like we just can't stop. Like I'm gonna go to a protest later today. I'm gonna continue doing my work with my students. We just have to keep doing the work. And I think in the US, like it's more important than ever, and the stakes are higher than ever. And so we're gonna lose people, obviously. So I think that imagining another future does play a role in keeping us going too, because we have to have something to look towards. And, you know, what is happening in Gaza is just unbearable. It is beyond imagine like it is beyond imagination that this is happening. And also we all saw it coming for so long. But I think, yeah, I just want to thank everybody for continuing doing the work and for contributing in whatever way that any of us can. And maybe that's a conversation, you know, around your kitchen table with your family. And maybe that's doing direct action. All is important. Maybe that's donating to get food aid in. Whatever you can do, you can do. For me, this is a big tent moment. Like,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I always say, and do more. Today's episode was produced by Yardain Emran, Samantha Haley, and me. If you like our podcast, please follow us, rate us, like us, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be sharing some mutual aid campaigns that Sarah has identified on our Instagram. You can follow us at Another Ed is Possible. We'll also be sharing some links to educational pamphlets about the film and things like that. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.